In 1929, inside Topkapı Palace in Istanbul, a fragment of parchment returned from obscurity. It was old, damaged, incomplete. But what it seemed to contain was far more unsettling than its condition. Drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, the map appeared, at least to some observers, to preserve knowledge that did not quite belong to its century. Coastlines, Atlantic worlds, hints of lost sources, and one quiet, impossible question. How much did the past know before the modern world began keeping score? To understand why this fragment still disturbs the imagination, we have to slow down. Not because every legend around it is true, many are not. Some have grown far beyond the evidence, but because the map sits at a strange crossing point, where real history, missing documents, maritime intelligence, and modern speculation all begin to blur. A fragile piece of parchment can survive in a palace archive for centuries and still refuse to behave like a simple object. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Imagine the room where it was found, not as a treasure chamber from a fantasy, but as a working archive of empire, filled with papers that had outlived the men who made them. The Piri Reis map was not complete. It was only a surviving fragment. Yet sometimes a fragment is more dangerous than a whole document, because the missing parts begin to speak for themselves. And that is where this story begins, not with certainty, but with a rediscovery. A map made by an Ottoman sailor, a palace that kept its secrets quietly, and a coastline that seemed to ask whether history had misplaced something. Piri Reis was not a sorcerer. That may sound like an odd place to begin, but it matters. Because the more famous his map became, the easier it became to detach the man from the world that produced him. In modern retellings, he is sometimes treated less like a working sailor and more like a gatekeeper of forbidden knowledge, as if he had stepped out of legend carrying a chart no ordinary human could understand. The historical Piri Reis was more interesting than that. He was an Ottoman admiral, a navigator, a cartographer, and a man shaped by water in its most dangerous form. Not the romantic sea of postcards and sunset paintings, but the sea as a battlefield, a marketplace, a border, a grave, and a road. To live by it in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was to live inside a moving conflict. The Mediterranean was not a calm blue center of civilization. It was an arena. Ships carried silk, grain, timber, metal, enslaved people, spices, letters, weapons, rumors, and disease. Ports were not simply places of arrival. They were listening posts. A dockside conversation could matter as much as a cannon. A captured pilot might be more valuable than a chest of coins, because a pilot carried something empires desperately needed: memory. He knew which harbor could shelter a fleet when the weather turned. He knew where reefs waited under innocent-looking water. He knew which island had fresh water, which channel was watched, which current could carry a careless ship toward disaster. This was the world that made Piri Reis. He did not emerge from a library alone, though books and charts mattered deeply to him. He came from a maritime culture where knowledge was tested against wind, rock, hunger, and enemy sails on the horizon. A wrong line on a map was not merely an academic mistake. It could tear open a hull. It could lose a cargo. It could kill men whose names were never written down. That is one of the first things people misunderstand about the Piri Reis map. They look at it as a puzzle, almost as if it were created for later generations to decode. But to its maker, cartography was not a parlor game. It was intelligence work. Piri Reis lived during a period when the Ottoman Empire was expanding into a major imperial force, and the sea was inseparable from that ambition. The empire did not only advance by marching armies over land. It needed ships. It needed ports. It needed sailors who understood the old routes and the new ones. It needed information gathered from merchants, captains, prisoners, pilots, raiders, diplomats, and rivals. The line between sailor and spy was not always clean, nor was the line between piracy and naval warfare. In the Mediterranean world of Piri Reis, maritime violence often wore different uniforms depending on who was telling the story. One empire's corsair could be another empire's criminal. One raid could be condemned as piracy in one court and celebrated as holy war or patriotic service in another. Trade, religion, revenge, and state policy braided together until they could no longer be easily separated. And into that unstable world came the news of the Atlantic. The old Mediterranean powers had long understood their own sea as the center of the known world. But by Piri Reis's lifetime, the horizon had cracked open. Portuguese voyages down the coast of Africa, Spanish expeditions across the ocean, and the reports associated with Columbus had begun to reshape geography itself. This was not just exploration in the clean, heroic sense often used in schoolbook histories. It was also competition. Whoever knew more could sail farther, claim more, trade earlier, fight better, and hide discoveries from rivals. Maps became weapons, not always weapons of iron, but weapons of advantage. A chart could shorten a voyage. A coastline copied from an enemy source could expose a route someone else had tried to keep secret. A rumor from a captured sailor could be checked against older maps and turned into a strategic possibility. The sea rewarded those who collected fragments and punished those who ignored them. This is why Piri Reis should be seen not as a mysterious outsider, but as a man positioned at one of the great crossroads of information. Ottoman, Islamic, Mediterranean, European, and Atlantic knowledge did not live in sealed boxes. It moved through war, trade, translation, capture, imitation, and practical need. A map made in Istanbul could contain echoes from Genoa, Venice, Portugal, Spain, North Africa, and places farther west that many in the Eastern Mediterranean had never seen. That does not make the map supernatural. It makes it human, and perhaps that is the more unsettling idea. Not that one man possessed impossible knowledge, but that the world before modern archives was already exchanging information in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct. We are left with the parchment, but not all the conversations that fed it. We see the ink, but not the hands that passed earlier charts across tables, decks, markets, and prisons. Piri Reis survived in a world where survival itself required attention. A sailor who lived long enough to become an old authority did so by noticing what others missed. The angle of a coast, the habits of winds, the exaggerations of men bragging in ports, the useful detail hidden inside a story that was mostly false. That kind of intelligence is quieter than legend, but far more durable. So before the map becomes a doorway into theories of lost continents and vanished civilizations, it has to be returned to the man who made it, an Ottoman admiral, a compiler of maritime knowledge. A professional in an age when the sea was both opportunity and threat. The mystery does not shrink when we place him back in history. It becomes sharper, because now the question is no longer simply, how could Piri Reis have known? The better question is, what kind of world allowed such knowledge to reach him? And how much of that world has disappeared without leaving its own map behind? An empire does not become a sea power simply by owning ships. Ships rot. Sailors desert. Storms scatter fleets that looked impressive in harbor. A coastline drawn proudly on a map can become useless when the wind turns against you, or when the man steering the vessel has never seen the entrance to the port at night. The Ottoman Empire understood this in practical terms. Its power at sea depended on more than banners and cannons. It depended on infrastructure, the unglamorous machinery behind movement. Naval bases, shipyards, coastal fortresses, supply points, pilots who knew local waters, captains who could read weather before it became disaster, officials who could gather reports and turn them into orders, men who had memorized where timber could be found, where rope could be purchased, where fresh water was available, where enemy vessels were likely to appear. This was the Sea Machine. Not a single machine, of course, but a living system of people, ports, materials, routes, and information. And like every living system, it was vulnerable to ignorance. The Ottoman world faced water on several fronts. The Mediterranean connected it to North Africa, Italy, Spain, and the great commercial cities whose wealth depended on maritime access. The Aegean was crowded with islands, channels, hidden anchorages, and rival interests. The Black Sea mattered for grain, trade, and imperial security. Farther south and east, other waters drew Ottoman attention as imperial ambitions widened. To control such spaces, the empire needed knowledge that was local, precise, and constantly renewed. A palace could command a fleet to sail, but the palace could not tell a captain exactly how a reef looked under a pale morning sky. A sultan could order a campaign, but he could not personally know every harbor mouth, every seasonal current, every dangerous shoal. That kind of knowledge lived in sailors. It lived in pilots. It lived in men who might never become famous, because the best maritime intelligence was often carried by people whose names history treated as disposable. Maps helped preserve that knowledge, but they did not replace experience. This is why early modern nautical information had such a layered quality. A chart might show a coastline, but a sailing direction could warn that the safe anchorage was not where it appeared. A pilot might know that a harbor was excellent in one wind and deadly in another. A port might look open from the sea, yet be politically closed because the wrong flag was flying over it. The physical coast and the human coast were never quite the same thing, and the Ottomans had to navigate both. Their sea power grew within a world of constant contest. Venetian merchants, Genoese traditions, Spanish and Portuguese expansion, North African corsairs, Christian military orders, local rulers, island communities, and shifting alliances all pressed against one another. The Mediterranean was a room where everyone could hear everyone else moving, even when they pretended not to. So knowledge traveled in strange ways. A captured ship could become a library. A prisoner could become a source. A merchant could carry news more valuable than cargo. A sailor who changed employers might bring with him years of accumulated roots and habits. Even hostility created exchange. War closed some doors, but it also broke open others. This is the background, that makes Piri Reis's work intelligible. He was not collecting maps because he had a hobby in decorative geography. He was operating in a culture where information was part of naval strength. To know the shape of the coast was to reduce uncertainty. To reduce uncertainty was to save time, ships, money, and lives. And in imperial terms, saving those things could mean the difference between a successful campaign and a humiliating failure. But there is a deeper point here, one easy to miss. When modern viewers imagine old maps, they often think of them as primitive versions of the maps we use now. In that view, every old chart is judged by how closely it resembles a satellite image. Accurate lines are admired. Strange lines are mocked or turned into mysteries. But for sailors in Piri Reis's world, a map was not mainly a picture of the Earth. It was a tool for decision-making under risk. A coastline did not need to satisfy a modern geographer to be useful. It needed to help a crew survive passage from one known place to another. It needed to preserve relationships. This island near that cape, this harbor beyond that headland, this dangerous passage after that stretch of coast. It was less like a perfect portrait and more like a memory system, one that could be copied, corrected, damaged, improved, misunderstood, and carried into new waters. That is why the Ottoman Sea Machine depended on both discipline and improvisation. There were fleets, ranks, bases, and imperial orders, yes, but there were also whispered updates, rough sketches, local guides, inherited sailing lore, and the hard corrections made after someone nearly died. The most useful knowledge was rarely pure. It came mixed with rumor, exaggeration, enemy secrecy, old tradition, and fresh observation. Piri Reis lived inside that mixture. The world around him did not separate cleanly into official science and sailor's tale. A chart might contain a measured coast beside a copied legend. A practical guide might preserve ancient place names beside current warnings. A navigator could be both skeptical and superstitious, careful and credulous, brilliant and wrong in the same day. That does not make the knowledge worthless. It makes it historical. And in the early 16th century, historical knowledge was often messy because the world itself was expanding faster than its systems of verification. Reports from the Atlantic did not arrive as neat data. They arrived through human channels, some reliable, some self-serving, some misunderstood, some deliberately hidden. A newly encountered coast could be mistaken for an island. A river mouth could be stretched into a gulf. A blank area could invite an old theory to fill it. The unknown did not remain empty for long. Mapmakers often placed something there, because emptiness itself was uncomfortable. The Ottoman Empire, like its rivals, had to make decisions in that uncertainty. This is the practical pressure behind the beauty of Piri Reis's cartography. His maps were not merely artworks, though they could be visually striking. They belonged to a world where drawn coastlines had consequences. The palace, the admiralty, the shipyard, the harbor, and the open sea were connected by the fragile thread of information. And the thread was always at risk of breaking. A fleet could be built with timber and iron, but it sailed on memory. It moved through inherited routes, corrected by experience and sharpened by necessity. The mapmaker's task was not to possess the whole truth of the world. It was to gather enough truth from enough places to make movement possible. That is the real beginning of the Piri Reis mystery. Not a single parchment found centuries later, but the vast and mostly vanished system that made such a parchment possible. Pilots, ports, captains, Copied charts, enemy secrets, imperial appetite, and the pressure of dangerous water. Long before anyone argued about Antarctica or lost civilizations, the map belonged to this machine. A machine built to answer a simpler question, one that every sailor understood without philosophy. Where are we, and how do we live long enough to reach the next shore? Before a map could become a mystery, a ship had to survive long enough to make the map necessary. That is easy to forget when we look at old cartography through modern eyes. We see parchment, ink, coastlines, names, decorative ships, wind roses, strange creatures in the margins. We treat the map as the center of the story. But for the people who first needed these charts, the true center was the vessel beneath their feet. A pre-modern ship was not simply transportation, it was a compromise with danger. Every plank, rope, sail, oar, mast, nail, and seam represented a decision made against the sea's appetite for mistakes. Build too heavy, and the vessel became sluggish. Build too light, and it might not survive rough water. Depend too much on oars, and crews exhausted themselves. Depend too much on sails, and a dead wind could turn ambition into helpless drifting. Carry too much cargo, and speed vanished. Carry too little, and the journey might not be worth the risk. The technology of ancient and medieval ships was not primitive in the careless sense. It was practical, specialized, and hard-earned. Mediterranean galleys, for example, were built for a world of coastal warfare, raiding, and maneuver. Their oars allowed movement even when the wind refused to cooperate. That made them dangerous in battle and useful in tight waters. But oars demanded human bodies, rowers, food, water, discipline, space. A galley could be fast and frightening, yet it was also tied to the coastline by its own needs. Sailing ships opened other possibilities. With the right rigging and enough skill, wind could do the labor of many men. A sail could carry a vessel farther, with more cargo, across broader water. But sails did not remove uncertainty, they only changed its shape. The wind was power, but it was not obedient. A captain had to understand not only where he wanted to go, but what the season, current, coastline, and weather might allow. This is where maps begin to feel less like art and more like survival equipment. A coastline was not an outline. It was a sequence of decisions. Where could a ship take shelter? Where did the shore fall away into deep water? Where did sandbars shift? Which island could be seen from which cape? What harbor was safe in a northern wind but deadly in a southern one? Where might fresh water be found? Where would enemies wait because everyone knew the same passage had to be used? The sea did not reward general knowledge. It rewarded usable knowledge. For most sailors in the ancient and medieval world, navigation was often coastal. This did not mean timid. Coastal sailing could be brutally difficult. The land was both guide and threat. Staying near shore helped crews recognize landmarks, find shelter, and avoid losing themselves entirely. But shorelines are full of traps. Rocks hide under breaking water. Headlands distort distance. Fog erases reference points. Familiar mountains change shape depending on the angle of approach. At night, even a known coast can become a dark wall with teeth. A good sailor learned to read the world in fragments. The color of water, the behavior of birds, the smell of land after days at sea, the rhythm of waves near shallows. a line of cloud above an island not yet visible. The difference between a safe bay and a seductive inlet that could trap a ship when the wind shifted. None of this fits easily into the modern idea of a map as a clean, objective image viewed from above. Pre-modern navigation was embodied. It lived in hands, eyes, memory, repetition, fear, and correction. Charts grew out of that lived knowledge. They were not born only in quiet rooms among scholars with compasses and ink. They were also born from damaged hulls, failed landings, narrow escapes, and the testimony of men who had learned to respect one ugly stretch of water. This matters for Piri Reis because his work belonged to a very long inheritance. By the time he drew and compiled his maps, sailors had been accumulating maritime knowledge across generations, and not in a straight line. Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Italian, Iberian, North African, and Ottoman traditions had all touched the sea in different ways. Knowledge could be preserved in formal texts, but it could also survive as route memory, harbor lore, pilot instruction, and copied charts whose original makers were already forgotten. A shipbuilder might never draw a world map, but his craft shaped what mapmakers could know. The range of vessels affected the range of observation. The type of hull influenced where a ship could go. The need for frequent provisioning kept some voyages close to land. Improvements in rigging, hull strength, and ocean-going practice widened the possible horizon. Technology did not merely carry explorers into geography. It decided which geographies could be encountered at all. And still, every advance had limits. The pre-modern sea was not conquered. It was negotiated with. Even strong vessels could be lost to storms that left no testimony. Even skilled crews could misjudge a current. Even experienced captains relied on estimates that could drift into error day after day. Latitude could eventually be measured with increasing confidence, but longitude remained a far more stubborn problem for centuries. Distance at sea was often a matter of judgment, and judgment could be distorted by weather, fear, fatigue, and hope. So when we examine an old map and find a coastline stretched, rotated, duplicated, or misplaced, we should not immediately leap to the most glamorous explanation. Sometimes the strange line is not the footprint of a vanished civilization. Sometimes it is the scar left by difficult travel, imperfect instruments, copied mistakes, and the human need to turn uncertain experience into something that can be carried. That does not make the map less fascinating. It makes it more intimate. Every confident stroke of ink may hide a chain of vulnerable moments. A sailor glimpsing land through rain, a captain repeating a route from memory, a pilot correcting another man's error, a cartographer deciding which source deserved trust. The finished map looks still. The making of it was anything but still. This is the ancient technology behind Piri Reis's world. Not only ships of wood and sail, but systems of attention. A vessel forced humans to observe carefully, because the punishment for fantasy was immediate. The reef did not care about legend. The storm did not respect rank. The wrong harbor did not become safer because a mapmaker decorated it beautifully. Maps were attempts to remember what the sea had taught, before the lesson had to be paid for again. And this is why the Piri Reis fragment can feel so powerful without needing to be impossible. It carries the residue of maritime experience from many worlds, some named, some lost, some only faintly detectable through copied shapes and inherited coastlines. Behind the parchment is not one secret hand, but centuries of ships moving through danger and leaving behind traces of what they learned. The mystery, then, is not only what the map shows. It is how many voyages, mistakes, repairs, fears, and survivals had to happen before such a thing could be drawn at all. Long before the 1513 map became the object that pulled modern curiosity toward Piri Reis, there was another work that tells us more about the mind behind it. The Kitab-ı Bahriye, often translated as the Book of the Sea, is not a book in the modern sense of a neat, detached atlas meant to sit untouched on a shelf. It is closer to a sailor's intelligence archive. It gathers maps, coastal descriptions, practical directions, warnings, observations, and inherited knowledge into a form meant for people who understood that geography was not decoration. Geography was consequence. This is where Piri Reis becomes easier to see. Not as a lonely genius staring into forbidden ancient sources, not as the accidental guardian of some impossible secret, but as a compiler. And that word should not be treated as small. In a maritime world, to compile well was an act of judgment. Anyone could repeat a rumor. Anyone could copy a coastline. The harder task was deciding what deserved to be preserved, what needed correction, what might be useful even if uncertain, and what kind of knowledge a sailor would actually need when the coast came into view. A bad compiler makes a pile. A good compiler makes a working instrument. The Kitab-ı Bahriye belongs to that second category. Its concern is not the abstract beauty of the world seen from heaven. It is the world approached from a deck. Coast by coast, island by island, harbor by harbor, it reflects the way sailors encountered geography. Sequentially, cautiously, always asking what the next visible sign might mean. That detail changes the meaning of Piri Reis's larger reputation. The more extravagant theories surrounding his 1513 map often depend on imagining him as a receiver of lost, almost magical information. But his major nautical work suggests something more grounded and, in some ways, more impressive. He was part of a tradition that valued accumulation. He understood that knowledge at sea rarely arrives complete. It comes in pieces, and the person who gathers the pieces must know the difference between a useful fragment and a dangerous illusion. There is a quiet discipline in that. A sailing direction may not seem dramatic beside a mysterious world map. A note about an anchorage does not have the glamour of a supposed hidden continent. But for sailors, these smaller details mattered more. Where can a ship enter safely? Where does the wind become treacherous? Where is the water deep enough? Which island offers shelter, and which only appears to do so from a distance? These are not questions asked by dreamers. They are questions asked by men who expect the sea to punish vagueness. The Kitab-ı Bahriye also reminds us that maritime knowledge was not simply discovered once and then owned forever. It had to be renewed. A coastline could be politically transformed. A harbor might become dangerous because of war, not because of rocks. A route that was safe in one generation could become risky in another. Local conditions mattered. Human conditions mattered. Geography was stable only in the broadest sense. The lived sea changed with power. That is why a work like Piri Reis's could combine first-hand observation with inherited intelligence. He did not need to personally see every place he described in order to preserve knowledge about it. No serious compiler of maritime information worked that way. The sea was too large, the routes too many, the dangers too varied. Instead, knowledge moved through networks. Pilots, captains, merchants, raiders, prisoners, officials, and older chart makers all contributed, willingly or not, to the shared memory of the sea. This is where the romance of the story becomes quieter. but also deeper. A map can make knowledge look solitary. One name appears on the object, and we begin to imagine one mind standing behind every line. But a nautical book exposes the collective nature of navigation. Piri Reis's name matters, yet behind it stands a crowd we cannot fully recover. Men who noticed reefs, men who misread coastlines, men who survived storms, men who lied, men who corrected lies, men who copied older sources whose own sources had already vanished. The mapmaker's art was partly the art of listening, and listening in a violent maritime world was not simple. The person giving information might be frightened, proud, confused, wounded, bribed, boasting, or trying to survive captivity. A sailor's memory could be vivid and wrong. A chart could be beautiful and outdated. A local guide could know one inlet perfectly and know nothing beyond the next headland. A compiler had to navigate human unreliability before his readers ever navigated water. This makes Piri Reis's work feel less like a static document and more like a conversation across generations. In that conversation, the Mediterranean speaks loudly. Its coasts had been mapped, sailed, fought over, and described for centuries. But by Piri Reis's lifetime, the conversation had expanded. The Atlantic was no longer a rumor at the edge of older geography. Reports from Western voyages were circulating. Iberian knowledge, Portuguese experience along Africa, and information associated with Columbus had entered the bloodstream of map-making. Some of it was guarded, some of it leaked, some of it was captured, some of it was misunderstood. The Kitab Bahriye helps us understand how such information could be treated, not as sacred revelation, but as material to be weighed. That may be the most important shift. When modern mystery turns toward the Piri Reis map, it often asks, what ancient secret did he possess? But Piri Reis's broader work encourages another question. How did practical knowledge travel before modern institutions made knowledge look orderly? The answer is not as clean as we might like. It traveled through empire, conflict, commerce, memory, and need. It traveled in the margins of war. It traveled in the speech of sailors who may never have imagined that their words would someday feed a map studied half a millennium later. There is something almost haunting in that, but not because it proves a lost super-civilization. It is haunting because it shows how much of human knowledge has always lived close to disappearance. A ship sinks, and a route dies with its pilot. A chart burns, and a copied coastline becomes the only surviving witness. A palace stores a document, and centuries later we mistake survival for completeness. The fragment remains, but the full machinery of its making is gone. The Book of the Sea gives us a better way to approach that loss. It tells us that Piri Reis was not merely drawing the world. He was gathering a working memory of it. He was shaping scattered maritime experience into something that could move from one mind to another, from one ship to another, from one danger to the next. And perhaps this is why the 1513 map still feels alive. It belongs to the same instinct, the desire to catch knowledge before it vanishes beneath weather, war, secrecy, and time. Before we ask whether the map contains impossible geography, we should recognize the very human achievement already in front of us. Piri Reis preserved movement. He took the unstable knowledge of sailors, practical, flawed, precious, sometimes borrowed, sometimes first-hand, and gave it form. Not perfect form, not final form, but form enough to survive. The surviving 1513 map does not arrive before us as a complete world. It arrives wounded. Only a fragment remains, and that fact should shape everything we say about it. We are not looking at the full design Piri Reis once made. We are looking at a surviving piece of a larger object, a torn remnant whose missing portions have become almost as famous as the ink that remains. This is one reason the map is so vulnerable to speculation. A complete document can still be debated, of course, but a fragment invites the imagination to step into the torn edges. What was lost? What did the rest of the map show? Did it contain clarifying details that would make the surviving section less mysterious? Or did it contain even stranger material, now gone beyond recovery? We cannot know, and because we cannot know, the fragment has become a kind of historical mirror. Different people see different things in it. Some see an Ottoman achievement in the Portolan tradition. Some see a rare survival of early Atlantic geography. Some see evidence of lost European sources. Some see something much older, more dramatic, and far more difficult to prove. The map itself was drawn in 1513, at a moment when the geography of the Atlantic was being violently rewritten. Europe, Africa, and the newly encountered lands across the ocean were becoming part of a shared cartographic problem. But the information available to mapmakers was uneven. Some coastlines were known through repeated sailing. Others were known through reports, copies, rumor, or guarded intelligence. The world was expanding, but not evenly illuminated. A modern map suggests confidence. The Piri Reis map belongs to an age of partial knowledge. That is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. The surviving fragment shows parts of the Atlantic world, including the western coast of Africa and portions associated with South America. It also contains annotations, which are essential because they remind us that the object is not merely a drawing. It is a statement about sources, authority, and compilation. Piri Reis did not present himself as inventing the world from nothing. He claimed to have drawn from multiple earlier maps and materials. That claim is the hinge of the mystery. Because if his map was built from older sources, then the central question moves backward. It is no longer only, what did Piri Reis know? It becomes, what did his sources know and where did those sources go? This is where the map becomes quietly unsettling without needing exaggeration. Most maps do not survive. Most working documents disappear. Charts are used, copied, corrected, damaged by salt, lost in war, burned, stolen, or discarded when they become obsolete. The survival of any early map can be almost accidental. So when Piri Reis tells us that he relied on earlier materials, we should not be surprised that many of those materials are lost. Loss is not the exception in history. Loss is the normal condition. What survives is the strange part. The map is often associated with the Portolan chart tradition, a practical style of maritime mapping known for coastal detail, networks of direction lines, and usefulness to sailors. Portolan charts were not the same as modern maps built from standardized projections and global measurements. They were navigational tools, shaped by experience, copying, and the needs of movement. They could be remarkably effective in familiar seas and less reliable when stretched into global ambition. This matters because a Portolan-style map can look more precise than it truly is in some areas, and more mysterious than it deserves to be in others. A strong coastline may reflect good source material. It may also reflect confident copying. It may preserve an error inherited from a respected chart. It may combine several traditions that did not fit together cleanly. A map is not one voice. It is often a choir, and sometimes the choir is singing in different keys. Piri Reis's annotations suggest that he used a variety of sources, including older maps and information from the Atlantic world. The exact nature of all those sources remains uncertain. That uncertainty has given the map its long afterlife. If every source were known, catalogued, and preserved, the mystery would be smaller. But the missing sources leave behind a gap wide enough for serious inquiry and wild imagination to stand side by side. We should be careful here. A lost source does not automatically mean an ancient source. A map older than 1513 could be only a few years older and still matter enormously. In the early age of discovery, even a recent chart could contain information considered secret, valuable, or politically explosive. A copy of a Portuguese or Spanish source could preserve knowledge that had not yet become widely available. That alone would be historically significant. The temptation is to make lost mean prehistoric, because prehistoric loss feels more cinematic. But the age of discovery itself produced enough missing knowledge to haunt us. Ships returned with sketches. Pilots carried mental charts. Royal archives guarded information. Rival powers tried to steal or intercept it. Documents vanished in bureaucracies, wars, fires, and simple neglect. An ordinary lost map from the early 16th century could still feel extraordinary if it captured the first uncertain outlines of lands newly entering Old World cartography. This is especially important when discussing the Atlantic. The Atlantic was not just a blank space suddenly filled by heroic explorers. It was a zone of secrecy and competition. Information about coastlines, islands, currents, and routes had monetary and imperial value. To know where land lay was to claim, trade, convert, raid, or defend. The mapmaker who gathered such knowledge was participating in a geopolitical struggle, whether or not the ink looked peaceful on parchment. So the 1513 map should be read not merely as an image, but as evidence of circulation. Something reached Piri Reis, maybe through captured materials, maybe through sailors, maybe through older Mediterranean chart traditions, maybe through maps copied from maps copied from maps. The exact chain is broken, and that broken chain is the heart of the mystery. Yet the broken chain also warns us against overconfidence. We cannot simply choose the most exciting missing link and call it proof. The absence of a source is not evidence for any source we prefer. It is evidence that the archive is incomplete. That distinction may sound cautious, but it is what keeps the story honest. The most haunting thing about the Piri Reis map is not that it proves the impossible. It is that it preserves the residue of vanished knowledge networks. It shows us how much early modern cartography depended on materials that no longer exist, and on people whose contributions were never individually recorded. A line of coast on the parchment may be the final descendant of a route sailed by someone whose name was forgotten before the ink dried. There is a loneliness to that. Not the loneliness of a secret civilization hiding beneath history, but the loneliness of documents surviving without their witnesses. A map usually seems to promise orientation. It says, here is the world, here is the coast, here where you stand. But this map does something stranger. It orients us toward what is missing. The lost sources are not decoration around the story. They are the story's engine. They remind us that knowledge does not always move forward in a clean line. Sometimes it flashes briefly, is copied imperfectly, and then disappears, leaving later generations to argue over the shape of the flash. Piri Reis's map is fragile because parchment is fragile. It is mysterious because its sources are gone. And it is powerful because, in that small surviving fragment, we can still feel the pressure of a much larger world pressing through the ink. A world of sailors, spies, captains, rivals, archives, rumors, and vanished charts, all reduced now to one damaged piece of skin that refuses to stop asking where its own knowledge came from. Among the many claims attached to the Piri Reis map, one has always had a quieter force than the legends of Antarctica or vanished civilizations. It is the claim that somewhere inside this Ottoman fragment there may be traces of a map associated with Christopher Columbus. Not the Columbus of statues and schoolbook simplifications. Not the mythic figure turned into either pure hero or pure villain, depending on the century doing the remembering. But Columbus the navigator, the ambitious project maker, the man whose Atlantic voyages generated information that powerful people wanted to control. This possibility changes the atmosphere of the mystery. It brings the story out of the realm of the impossible and into something more historically believable, but no less intriguing. The disappearance of early Atlantic intelligence. Piri Reis himself, in the notes connected to his map, refers to sources behind his work. Among the traditions surrounding the map is the idea that he used material linked to Columbus, or to charts derived from Columbus's voyages. The evidence is not simple enough to treat as a solved case. We do not possess a neat chain of custody. We cannot place one surviving Columbus map beside Piri Reis's parchment and say, line by line, here is the transfer. That kind of certainty is not available. But the idea matters because it fits the world of 1513 better than most of the more spectacular theories do. By then, Columbus's first voyage was already 2 decades in the past. Reports, charts, claims, corrections, exaggerations, and rival interpretations had been circulating through the Atlantic powers. Some information was guarded by crowns, some leaked through sailors, some was captured, some was misunderstood, some became obsolete almost as soon as new voyages returned. The Atlantic was not only being explored, it was being argued over. Maps were part of that argument. A map could support a claim of possession. It could hide a route. It could exaggerate the importance of a coast. It could reduce uncertainty enough to encourage the next expedition. It could also preserve mistakes, because the first reports of new lands were often filtered through older expectations. Columbus himself did not understand the Americas in the way later mapmakers would. He sailed into a world that did not fit the geography he expected. That mismatch is crucial. Early Atlantic maps did not simply record discoveries. They tried to force unfamiliar coastlines into familiar mental frames. Islands, peninsulas, mainland, Asia, unknown lands. These categories blurred under pressure. So if Piri Reis preserved traces of Columbian cartography, what he may have preserved was not a perfect revelation, but an early confusion. And early confusion can be historically precious. There is a tendency to imagine lost maps as superior maps. We picture some vanished chart that knew more than its surviving descendants, as if history were a library where the most accurate volume was always the one that burned. Sometimes that may be true. More often, a lost map was valuable not because it was flawless, but because it captured a moment of transition before later knowledge smoothed away the uncertainty. A Columbus-linked source would be valuable for exactly that reason. It might show how the Atlantic world appeared before the categories settled. It might contain coastlines drawn from partial voyages, islands placed with confidence they did not deserve, or mainland features interpreted through a mistaken theory of Asia. It might reveal not the final truth of geography, but the first shock of contact between expectation and coastline. That is a different kind of mystery, less cosmic perhaps, more human, and in many ways, more haunting. Because the lost cartographic intelligence of the early Atlantic did not disappear into myth. Much of it disappeared into politics. Spain and Portugal had every reason to treat geographic knowledge as strategic property. Routes meant wealth, coastlines meant claims, islands meant staging points, currents meant advantage. A sailor who knew where to go could become an asset. A chart that showed it could become a weapon. This world did not reward open publication. It rewarded guarded archives, controlled pilots, and selective disclosure. Of course, secrecy was never perfect. Sailors talked. Ships were captured. Officials copied documents. Rivals bribed, stole, listened, and guessed. Information moved even when states tried to cage it. That is where Piri Reis enters the shadow. He did not need to meet Columbus. He did not need access to some pristine original locked in an Iberian archive. A chart derived from Columbian knowledge could have passed through several hands before reaching him. It could have been copied, translated, simplified, corrected, or distorted. By the time a line reached the Ottoman mapmaker, it may have carried both information and damage. That is the nature of copied knowledge. It survives by changing. The possibility of a Columbus source also warns us against treating old as a single category. A map from 1498 would have been old to Piri Reis in one sense, a prior source, but not ancient. Yet in the context of Atlantic discovery, it could have been enormously important. A decade or two could separate rumor from strategy. A recent voyage could become a lost source. A working chart could vanish while a later compilation survived by accident. This is one reason the Piri Reis map has such power. It may be preserving fragments of maps that were once part of the urgent politics of discovery, but are now gone. The parchment becomes not a window into prehistory, but into the backstage of early modern empire. And that backstage was crowded. There were pilots trying to make sense of coasts they had only partly seen. There were royal officials deciding what should be shared and what should remain secret. There were rival courts hungry for any scrap of geographic advantage. There were sailors whose memories might be interrogated after capture. There were cartographers trying to reconcile old world views with new reports. And through all of this, the map of the world was being redrawn faster than certainty could keep up. In that speed, documents were lost, not always through conspiracy, sometimes through use. A chart on a ship was not a sacred relic. It could be folded, stained, corrected, exposed to weather, carried from hand to hand. Some maps were made for immediate utility, not eternal preservation. Others were copied into better-known works while the originals disappeared. The archive of exploration is not a clean museum shelf, it is a wreck field. So when people look at the Piri Reis map and sense that something is missing, they are not entirely wrong. Something is missing. But the missing thing may not be Atlantis, or a secret Templar inheritance, or a survey made before the Ice Age. It may be the first generation of Atlantic charts. Fragile, politically sensitive, constantly revised, and mostly lost to time. That loss is enough to explain why the map feels like a message from a half-lit room. The shadow of Columbus, then, is not a single dramatic proof. It is a plausible darkness around the surviving evidence. It reminds us that early discovery was not only about sailing west into the unknown, it was also about what happened after the ships returned. Who controlled the notes? Who copied the maps? Who believed the reports? Who misunderstood them? And who managed to obtain what others tried to hide? Piri Reis's map may preserve one of those after-images. Not Columbus himself standing behind the Ottoman Admiral, handing him a secret chart in some impossible scene of historical theater. Rather, a chain of information. Atlantic voyages, Iberian sources, maritime rumor, captured knowledge, copied coastlines, and an Ottoman cartographer skilled enough to gather distant signals into one surviving fragment. The real drama is not that a lost map may have existed. Of course, lost maps existed. The real drama is that one of their echoes may still be visible, faint, altered, and disputed, on parchment found centuries later in a palace archive. And if that echo belongs partly to the age of Columbus, then the Piri Reis map is not only a mystery of what was known. It is a mystery of what was hidden, what was copied, and what was allowed to vanish. The most dangerous part of an old map is often the line that looks almost familiar. A coastline that is plainly wrong can be dismissed. A fantasy island can be filed away as legend. A decorative monster does not usually trouble the historian, but a coast that seems close, not exact, not modern, but suggestive, begins to work on the mind. It invites comparison. It asks to be rotated, stretched, corrected, defended, doubted. The Piri Reis map has survived in part because some of its lines refuse to sit quietly. On the surviving fragment, the Atlantic world appears in a form that feels both recognizable and unstable. West Africa is there. The eastern edge of South America is there, or at least a strong version of it. Islands and coastlines gather across the ocean in a way that reflects the new geography of the early 16th century, when the Atlantic was becoming crowded with claims, mistakes, and discoveries. But then there is the southern landmass. This is the feature that has drawn the eye of believers, skeptics, and cautious observers for generations. At the lower portion of the surviving map, a bold stretch of land seems to extend where modern viewers do not expect it to behave. For some, this is the spark. They look at the shape and ask whether Piri Reis somehow preserved knowledge of a far southern continent. Others argue that what we are seeing is not Antarctica at all, but a distorted continuation of South America, shaped by the assumptions and limitations of the time. The difference matters. If the southern coast is Antarctica, the map becomes a doorway into an extraordinary claim. If it is a distorted South American coastline, or a conventional attempt to close an uncertain geography, the mystery changes completely. It becomes less about impossible ancient knowledge and more about how early cartographers handled incomplete information. And early cartographers often handled uncertainty by drawing through it. That may sound like a criticism, but it is not. A blank space on a map is honest, yet it is also unsettling. In an age when geography still carried classical inheritance, religious imagination, sailor testimony, and imperial ambition, mapmakers did not always leave unknown areas empty. They joined lines. They extended coasts. They used older theories to stabilize newer reports. They made the world continuous because the mind dislikes a broken edge. The southern landmass on the Piri Reis map belongs to this problem. It looks confident, but confidence in ink is not the same as certainty in knowledge. A coastline can be drawn boldly because the map maker knows it well. It can also be drawn boldly because he is copying a bold source, or because the conventions of the map require a finished-looking world. A firm line may hide a fragile chain of evidence. This is where interpretation becomes delicate. The depiction of South America on the map is one reason the object has attracted serious attention. For a map dated 1513, any strong representation of Atlantic geography is historically important. The Portuguese and Spanish were still gathering and guarding information. Reports from voyages along the coast of Brazil and the western Atlantic were circulating unevenly. A mapmaker in the Ottoman world who could assemble such material was clearly connected, directly or indirectly, to a wide network of maritime intelligence. That is already remarkable. It does not need a polar continent to become interesting. Yet the human eye is greedy for pattern. Once someone proposes that a line resembles something hidden or forbidden, it becomes difficult to unsee. The viewer begins searching for matches. A cape becomes a peninsula. A curve becomes a bay. A misplaced coast becomes evidence of lost precision. The map is no longer just being studied. It is being negotiated with. There is a lesson here about mystery itself. Mysteries often survive not because there is no evidence, but because there is just enough evidence to sustain disagreement. Too little, and the claim collapses. Too much, and the question is settled. The Piri Reis map lives in the middle. It offers real historical features, real annotations, real lost source problems, and real distortions. That combination gives the imagination something to grip. The coastlines of West Africa and South America also remind us that the map was made during a moment of transition between two ways of seeing the world. The older Mediterranean charting tradition was being stretched toward the Atlantic. A system that had served sailors well in enclosed and familiar seas now had to absorb oceans, continents, and reports from voyages reaching far beyond inherited frameworks. The result could be impressive, but also unstable. Think of a craftsman using a trusted tool for a task larger than the tool was built to handle. The tool does not become useless. It still does real work, but it begins to strain. That strain is visible in maps of the period. Coastlines might be accurate in one region and wildly uncertain in another. Distances could compress. Directions could shift. Islands might multiply or migrate. A coastline copied from one source might not align with a coastline copied from another. The mapmaker's challenge was not merely to draw what he knew, but to make incompatible fragments coexist on one surface. Piri Reis was doing exactly that. The map's Atlantic geography should be read as a compilation under pressure. It is not a simple report from one voyage. It is not a modern survey. It is not pure fantasy. It is a layered object made from materials of unequal quality. Some of those materials may have been fresh. Some may have been old. Some may have carried excellent coastal knowledge. Others may have carried inherited errors. This is why the map can appear both ahead of its time and trapped within its time. That contradiction is the source of its power. A purely modern-looking map from 1513 would be impossible to explain without rewriting history. A purely crude map would not hold attention for long. But the Piri Reis fragment is neither. It seems to know some things with startling confidence and misunderstand others with equal confidence. That is exactly what one might expect from a skilled compiler working with partial, uneven, and politically charged sources. And still, the southern landmass remains, not as proof, but as provocation. It provokes because it sits where the viewer wants an answer. It is too bold to ignore and too ambiguous to settle easily. It could be a misunderstood coast. It could be a copied convention. It could reflect geographical assumptions now unfamiliar to us. It could preserve a distorted source whose original context is gone. What it cannot responsibly be, without further evidence, is treated as automatic proof of a mapped Antarctica. The map does not give us that certainty, but it does give us something valuable. A glimpse of how early 16th century geography struggled to absorb the Atlantic. It shows a world being redrawn before the redrawing was complete. It shows knowledge arriving in fragments and being forced into form. It shows the confidence of empire meeting the confusion of discovery. That is why the coastline would not stay quiet, because it belongs to a moment when the world had become larger than the maps that tried to contain it. Because every line on the parchment carries both information and anxiety. Because a coast drawn 5 centuries ago can still make modern viewers argue about what counts as evidence. And perhaps because the map, in its damaged and stubborn way, exposes a weakness in us as much as a mystery in history. We do not only want to know what Piri Reis drew, we want the strange line to mean something. Some mysteries attract evidence. Others attract costumes. The Piri Reis map, unfortunately and understandably, has attracted both. And sooner or later, in the long afterlife of this parchment, the Knights Templar appear. They almost always do. There is a certain gravity to the Templar name. Once it enters a story, it pulls everything around it towards secrecy. Hidden archives, forbidden voyages, lost treasure, coded maps, suppressed knowledge, underground survival. The legend has become so powerful that the actual medieval order often disappears beneath the weight of what later centuries wanted it to be. In the case of the Piri Reis map, the so-called Templar connection is not supported by solid evidence. That needs to be said clearly. There is no reliable chain showing that the Knights Templar possessed ancient global maps, preserved secret knowledge of the Americas or Antarctica, and somehow passed that knowledge through hidden channels until it reached an Ottoman admiral in the early 16th century. It is a compelling story shape. It has atmosphere. It has all the furniture of a late-night mystery. Vanished knights, secret parchments, suppressed routes, and a map rediscovered in a palace. But atmosphere is not evidence. Still, dismissing the legend too quickly would miss something important. The reason the Templars keep appearing in stories like this is not simply that people enjoy conspiracy. It is because the historical Templars left behind a perfect narrative wound. They were powerful. They were wealthy. They operated across borders. They had military, religious, and financial roles. Then they were dramatically suppressed. Their fall created the kind of historical rupture into which later imagination pours itself. A powerful organization destroyed under pressure will almost always generate afterlives. People ask, what happened to its wealth? Where did its records go? Did some members escape? Was something hidden before the end? These questions are not absurd in the broadest sense. Institutions do hide assets. Archives do vanish. Survivors do scatter. But the existence of reasonable historical questions does not automatically validate every elaborate answer built on top of them. That distinction is where the Templar legend often loses its footing. A gap in the record becomes a tunnel. A rumor becomes a route. A coincidence becomes a coded message. A lost document becomes proof of a secret library. Then, once the legend becomes familiar, it starts attaching itself to unrelated mysteries like a traveling cloak. The Piri Reis map becomes another place to hang it. Why this map? Because it already contains everything the modern imagination needs. It is old. It is incomplete. It was found in an imperial palace. Its sources are partly lost. It appears to show Atlantic knowledge gathered from several traditions. It includes a controversial southern coastline. It belongs to an age of exploration, secrecy, and empire. In other words, it has enough real uncertainty that a legend can enter without immediately looking ridiculous. The Templar story uses that uncertainty as a door, but when we step through the door, the floor is missing. The chronology is a problem. The historical Templar order was suppressed in the early 14th century. Piri Reis drew his map in 1513 in an Ottoman context, using sources he himself associated with earlier charts and maritime knowledge. To connect those two worlds, one needs more than possibility. One needs transmission, documents, owners, copies, witnesses, references, material traces, something that shows how supposed Templar cartographic knowledge survived, moved, and reached him. Without that, the claim remains a modern legend placed over an early modern artifact. It is also worth asking what work the Templar myth is doing emotionally. Often, it allows people to preserve the feeling that official history is incomplete without doing the harder work of dealing with ordinary incompleteness. Real history loses documents constantly. Real archives are partial. Real knowledge moves through messy networks of sailors, merchants, translators, spies, captives, and bureaucrats. That kind of loss is difficult because it is not glamorous. It has no single hidden vault, no final key, no robed guardian standing in the dark. The Templar legend gives loss a face. It turns archival absence into deliberate concealment. It turns the broken chain of sources into a secret chain of custody. It makes uncertainty feel designed. That is psychologically satisfying. It is also risky. Because once every missing source becomes evidence of suppression, the historian can no longer distinguish between what is hidden and what is simply gone. And most of the past is simply gone. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because parchment decays, ships sink, wars burn records, governments reorganize, owners die, libraries scatter, and practical documents stop looking important once their immediate use has passed. The Piri Reis map does not need the Templars to be mysterious. Its real mystery is already strong enough. We have an Ottoman admiral compiling geographic information in a world where Mediterranean, Islamic, Iberian, African, and Atlantic knowledge could intersect through conflict and exchange. We have a surviving fragment whose sources are partly lost. We have a map drawn at a moment when the Atlantic was being redrawn under pressure from empire and secrecy. We have annotations that point backward to materials we cannot fully recover. That is not a weak story. It is a better story. The Templar version simplifies the mystery by giving it a familiar villain or guardian. The historical version complicates it by reminding us that knowledge rarely travels through one dramatic lineage. It travels sideways. It leaks. It is stolen, copied, misunderstood, improved, damaged, translated, and repurposed. The path from a sailor's observation shown to a palace archive is not a straight ceremonial corridor. it is a crowded harbor. Still, the legend's survival tells us something useful about the map's modern life. People do not attach the Templars to objects that feel ordinary. They attach them to objects that seem to have escaped explanation. The Piri Reis map became a magnet because it sits between confidence and uncertainty. It gives enough historical grounding to be real, and enough missing context to feel open. In that openness, modern myths gather. So the Templar legend should not be treated as evidence about Piri Reis. It should be treated as evidence about us. It reveals our hunger for continuity beneath broken history. We want to believe that knowledge did not simply vanish in salt water, fire, and neglect. We want to believe someone kept the full version. Someone guarded the map. Someone knew the world before the rest of us arrived late to the truth. But the harder possibility is also the more human one. No secret order may have held the answer. No hidden archive may be waiting to explain the southern coast. The lost sources may have been ordinary working maps, made by practical people and destroyed by ordinary time. Their disappearance is not less tragic because it lacks ceremony. In fact, it may be more tragic. The Templar legend offers a beautiful shadow, but when we look for its footprint on the parchment, it fades. What remains is Piri Reis himself, his maritime world, and the scattered intelligence of an age when maps were copied because ships needed to move and empires needed to know. That is where the investigation must stay anchored, not because legends have no power, but because power is not proof. And in this story, the real map is already fragile enough without covering it in someone else's myth. This is where the Piri Reis map leaves the safer waters of early modern history and sails directly into one of its most famous modern controversies. The idea is simple enough to be unforgettable. What if the southern landmass on the 1513 map is not a distorted piece of South America? What if it is Antarctica? And not Antarctica as modern explorers eventually encountered it, buried beneath immense ice sheets, but Antarctica as it might have looked in some remote age before the ice concealed its coast. It is a cinematic thought. A map in an Ottoman palace. A fragment drawn centuries before Antarctica was officially seen by modern explorers. A coastline that some believe resembles land now hidden beneath ice, and behind that resemblance, the suggestion of an older source. Perhaps far older than Piri Reis, older than Columbus, older than the known civilizations usually credited with mapping the world. No wonder the theory survived. It has the shape of a revelation. It turns a damaged map into a message from a vanished age. It suggests that history, as normally told, is not merely incomplete, but dramatically miscalibrated. It asks us to imagine that some lost intelligence passed through generations of copies until it reached the hands of an Ottoman admiral who may not even have understood what he was preserving. But a powerful idea is not the same as a proven one. The Antarctica interpretation is provocative, but it is not accepted mainstream history. It depends on several difficult steps, and every one of those steps must hold. First, the southern landmass has to be identified as Antarctica, rather than a distorted continuation of South America or a conventional southern coast. Then the coastline has to correspond meaningfully to Antarctica's land beneath the ice, not merely resemble it after selective comparison. Then there must be a plausible explanation for how such knowledge was obtained in deep antiquity, preserved across enormous spans of time, copied through unknown channels, and finally incorporated into Piri Reis's sources. That is a heavy chain. and a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. The appeal of the theory often begins with visual comparison. A line on the map is placed beside a modern outline. Curves are matched. Promontories are interpreted. Gaps are explained as distortion. The more one wants the match to work, the more flexible the map becomes. It can be rotated, stretched, reoriented, or treated as a corrupted copy of something more accurate. At a certain point, almost any old coastline can begin to look like almost any real coastline if enough adjustments are allowed. This does not mean every comparison is dishonest. It means comparison alone is dangerous. Maps are persuasive because they look like evidence even when we are still deciding what they represent. A drawn coast seems to speak in a factual voice. But an early 16th century map is not a photograph, and it is not a satellite rendering. It is a compilation produced through older traditions, incomplete reports, copying habits, and projection choices that do not behave like modern cartography. The southern landmass may feel bold, but boldness is not identity. A cartographer could extend South America southward because its full shape was not yet settled. A copied source could distort a coastline through scale and orientation. A map-making tradition might include speculative southern land as a balancing feature or inherited geographical expectation. The unknown South had a long, imaginative life before it became a surveyed continent. To draw land in the South was not automatically to know Antarctica. That point is easy to overlook because modern viewers already know Antarctica exists. We bring the continent with us when we look at the map. Piri Reis did not have that modern mental backdrop. His world was filled with reports arriving unevenly from the Atlantic and beyond. The problem before him was not, how do I hide Antarctica in a map? It was, how do I reconcile sources that may not agree, from oceans still being violently absorbed into imperial geography? The Antarctica theory also gains emotional force from the phrase, before the ice. It sounds like a door opening onto a lost planet. A green Antarctica, a coastline exposed, a world before catastrophe. But the phrase carries scientific burdens. Antarctica's ice history is not a small detail that can be pushed aside for the sake of mystery. If the map is claimed to show an ice-free Antarctic coast, then geology becomes central. We are no longer discussing only cartography. We are discussing climate history, glaciation, sea levels, and the deep chronology of the Earth. And that is where the theory begins to strain. Because even if one imagines an ancient source, it must come from a time when the relevant coastline was visible and surveyable. That pushes the claim into remote prehistory, far beyond the known map-making traditions that can be securely traced. It also requires a seafaring culture with impressive surveying ability, capable of reaching, recording, and transmitting Antarctic geography before that knowledge vanished from ordinary memory, but somehow survived in cartographic fragments. That is not impossible in the casual sense that anything can be imagined. It is unsupported in the evidentiary sense. The difference matters. History is full of surprises, and cautious historians should never pretend the past has already given up all its secrets. But caution cuts both ways. It keeps us open to new evidence, and it prevents us from treating a seductive possibility as if it were already demonstrated. A mystery should not become a verdict just because the verdict is more exciting than uncertainty. The Piri Reis map, honestly handled, does not require us to choose between boredom and fantasy. There is a middle ground, and it is rich enough. An Ottoman mapmaker in 1513 preserved a fragment of global geography drawn from earlier sources, some now lost. in an age when Atlantic knowledge was secretive, unstable, and rapidly changing. That is already a remarkable historical object. The Antarctica hypothesis adds another layer, but it does not replace the foundation. It should be presented as a modern interpretation, famous, cinematic, controversial, rather than as established fact. Its endurance tells us how deeply the map affects the imagination. We want the southern coastline to be a fingerprint from before recorded history. We want the parchment to whisper that civilization once reached farther than we thought, saw more than we remembered, and left only accidental traces for us to recover. There is beauty in that desire. There is also danger. Because when the desire becomes too strong, the map stops being allowed to be itself. Every distortion becomes secret accuracy. Every uncertainty becomes suppressed truth. Every missing source becomes a vanished civilization. The actual Piri Reis map, Ottoman, maritime, early modern, practical, fragmentary, gets buried beneath the ice of our own expectations. Perhaps that is the irony. The theory claims to uncover a hidden continent, but it can sometimes cover the real artifact with a mythology so thick that the historical parchment nearly disappears. So we can let the Antarctica idea stand where it belongs, at the edge of the story, powerful and unresolved, but not proven. It is a question some have asked of the map, not an answer the map clearly gives back. The southern coast remains strange, but strangeness is not the same as confirmation, and the deeper investigation must now move from the romance of that possibility into the harder terrain beneath it. The question of whether any prehistoric civilization could truly have mapped such a world, and whether the Earth itself leaves room for that dream. Once the Antarctica idea enters the room, it brings a much larger shadow with it. A single map is no longer enough. The theory begins to demand an entire vanished world behind the parchment. A prehistoric seafaring civilization, technically skilled, geographically ambitious, capable of surveying distant coasts, and somehow able to pass its knowledge forward through the wreckage of time. This is the grand version of the Piri Reis mystery. Not merely that Piri Reis used old sources. That part is plausible, even expected. He said he relied on earlier materials, and the maritime world of his age was filled with copied charts, captured intelligence, and inherited knowledge. The more dramatic claim is that some of those sources descended, indirectly, from a civilization so ancient that it mapped the globe before the Ice Age rearranged the world humans knew. It is an idea with enormous emotional power. Part of that power comes from humility. Modern people like to imagine themselves at the summit of knowledge, standing above the past with instruments, satellites, and clean data. The lost civilization theory reverses that posture. It suggests that the past may not have been climbing toward us. It may have risen, fallen, and left us only fragments. The feeling is almost vertiginous. Perhaps we are not the first to look widely across the earth. Perhaps we are only the latest to forget. That is why the theory keeps returning. It offers more than an explanation for a strange coastline. It offers a different philosophy of history. Civilizations do not always move upward in a straight line. Knowledge can be lost. Disasters can erase. Oral memory can become myth. Archives can burn. Skills can vanish when the systems that supported them collapse. All of that is true. The past is not a staircase. It is closer to a landscape of rises, ruins, dead ends, and unexpected survivals. But acknowledging lost knowledge is not the same as proving a lost global civilization. That is where the romance begins to outrun the evidence. For a prehistoric seafaring culture to explain the strongest claims about the Piri Reis map, it would need to have done several extraordinary things. It would need to reach remote southern waters. It would need to map coastlines with enough accuracy to survive later comparison. It would need to preserve that information through immense stretches of time. It would need its maps to pass into later ancient or medieval traditions without leaving a clearer trail. And it would need all this to happen while archaeology, geology, and known chronology remain strangely quiet about the civilization itself. That silence matters. Not because archaeology has found everything, it has not. New discoveries can revise major assumptions. Human history is older and more complex than earlier generations often believed. Coastal sites may have been drowned by rising seas after the last ice age. Organic materials decay. Settlements disappear. Entire ways of life can leave frustratingly little behind. So the question is not whether the ancient world still holds surprises. It does. The question is whether the evidence we have can support the size of the claim being placed on it. A lost harbor is one kind of claim. A forgotten coastal trading network is another. A sophisticated prehistoric civilization capable of global cartography is much larger. It requires more than a suggestive line on a copied 16th century map. It requires material culture, tools, settlements, shipbuilding evidence, navigational traditions, clear transmissions, multiple independent signs that point toward the same conclusion. Without that, the theory floats beautifully, but it does not anchor. And yet, it would be unfair to treat everyone drawn to this idea as foolish. The attraction is not only sensationalism, it comes from a real awareness that history is incomplete. Many official narratives have been too confident, too tidy, too dismissive of people outside the usual centers of written power. The sea especially hides evidence. Coastal peoples can be archaeologically elusive. A culture built around wood, fiber, boats, and shorelines may vanish more easily than one built in stone far inland. The lost civilization theory touches a genuine wound in historical knowledge, but then it tries to heal that wound with too large a bandage. This is the pattern we have to watch. A real uncertainty appears. The southern landmass on the map is ambiguous. Piri Reis used lost sources. Early Atlantic intelligence is incomplete. Ancient and medieval knowledge moved through channels we cannot fully reconstruct. From these real uncertainties, the theory leaps to a total explanation. A vanished advanced civilization must have mapped the world. The leap is the problem, not the curiosity, not the suspicion that history has gaps. The leap. Because once a single grand theory is placed over every gap, the gaps stop being studied on their own terms. A copied Portuguese source becomes less interesting. Ottoman intelligence networks become secondary. Portolan distortions are brushed aside. The messy, human, early modern world that actually produced Piri Reis's map is treated as a mere vessel for something older and more glamorous. That does a disservice to the artifact. It also does a disservice to the ancient world. Real ancient and prehistoric peoples were astonishing without needing to become a hidden super-civilization. They crossed seas, settled islands, tracked stars, read currents, built vessels, migrated across harsh landscapes, and developed deep environmental knowledge. Their achievements deserve attention in their own right. Turning them into a vague, lost empire can flatten the diversity and specificity of what humans actually did. The Piri Reis map invites humility, but not surrender. We can admit that knowledge was lost without inventing the exact shape of what was lost. We can recognize that ancient seafarers may have been more capable than once assumed without claiming they produced Antarctic surveys. We can be open to submerged coastal archaeology without making every ambiguous map line into a relic of the Ice Age. The strongest mysteries are not the ones that let us believe anything. They are the ones that teach us how to ask more carefully. So where does that leave the idea of a civilization before the ice? As a powerful modern myth built around real historical anxieties, the fragility of knowledge, the loss of coastal worlds, the incompleteness of archives, and the fear that human memory may be much shorter than human achievement. It survives because those anxieties are legitimate. But legitimacy of feeling is not the same as proof of fact. The map remains. The theory gathers around it, and between them is a difficult space where imagination and evidence keep testing each other. Perhaps that is why the story endures. The Piri Reis map does not simply make us wonder what one Ottoman admiral knew. It makes us wonder how much humanity has forgotten, and whether forgetting can sometimes look, from a distance, like concealment. But the Earth is not only a stage for human longing. It keeps its own record, in ice, stone, sediment, and time. And that record is less easily persuaded by the shape of a coastline on parchment. The most uncomfortable moment in any mystery is not when someone proposes an impossible idea. It is when the idea has to stand beside physical evidence. A map can be argued with. A coastline can be compared, rotated, stretched, reinterpreted. A torn parchment leaves room for uncertainty, and uncertainty is generous. It lets the imagination keep working. But geology is less generous. Ice cores, sediments, bedrock, glacial movement, sea levels, and the slow violence of climate history do not bend easily around a beautiful theory. This is where the romance of the Piri Reis map meets the cold weight of the Earth. If the southern landmass on the map is claimed to show Antarctica before it was covered by ice, then the debate can no longer remain only in the realm of cartography. It has to answer a harder question. When was Antarctica actually ice-free in any meaningful sense? And could humans capable of mapping it have existed at that time? That question changes the scale of the problem. It is one thing to imagine Piri Reis copying a lost chart from Columbus's world. That requires missing documents, maritime exchange, and a chain of transmission across decades. Difficult, but historically plausible. It is quite another to imagine a map preserving the coastline of an ice-free Antarctica. That requires the source knowledge to come from a period when the continent's coast was exposed, accessible, and surveyable. It also requires that knowledge to survive through ages of climatic upheaval, cultural change, lost languages, vanished archives, and countless opportunities for distortion. The farther back the theory travels, the heavier the burden becomes. Antarctica is not merely a continent with snow on top. It is a landscape shaped by deep glacial history. Its ice sheets are not a recent blanket casually thrown over a familiar shore. They are part of an immense geological system, built and altered over vast spans of time. The idea that a recognizable, ice-free Antarctic coastline was available to a human surveying civilization in any recent prehistoric period faces serious scientific objections. This does not mean Antarctica never changed. Of course it changed. Ice advances and retreats. Climate shifts. Sea levels rise and fall. Margins behave differently from interiors. The planet is dynamic, not frozen in one arrangement forever. But the question is not whether change occurred. The question is whether the specific claim required by the map theory fits the evidence. And here, the evidence becomes difficult for the romantic version. To support the strongest interpretation, one would need a relatively recent ice-free Antarctic coast, visible to human navigators. And then one would need a chain of map transmission from that remote observation to the sources used by Piri Reis. This is where speculation begins, stacking on speculation. One uncertain identification of a map feature becomes the foundation for an ancient survey. The ancient survey requires a lost civilization. The lost civilization requires transmission. The transmission requires missing maps, and the missing maps are then used to explain the original uncertain feature. It becomes circular. The map is treated as evidence for the civilization, and the imagined civilization is used to explain the map. That is not how strong historical argument works. A stronger case would need independent support, evidence of the civilization outside the map, evidence of its ships, evidence of its reach, evidence of its methods, evidence that Antarctic coastal knowledge entered later cartographic traditions in a traceable way, evidence that the geological conditions made the original observation possible within a human time frame. Without those supports, the theory remains suspended. Beautiful, but suspended. This is not a call to drain the mystery of wonder. It is a call to respect the difference between wonder and conclusion. The physical world matters because it prevents us from making the past into whatever shape our stories prefer. The ice is not an enemy of imagination. It is a witness. It says, if this happened, show where it fits, and that is a fair demand. There is also a simpler cartographic explanation available, and good investigation has to take simpler explanations seriously. The controversial southern land may be a distorted continuation of South America. It may reflect incomplete reports, copied errors, or inherited assumptions about southern geography. It may be the result of trying to reconcile incompatible sources on a single parchment. None of those explanations is as thrilling as Antarctica Before the Ice, but they require fewer unsupported steps. History often works that way. The less theatrical explanation is not always correct, but it should not be dismissed merely because it lacks thunder. The Piri Reis map was made in 1513, in a world where Atlantic geography was new, politically valuable, and only partially understood. South America itself was not yet settled in European and Mediterranean cartographic imagination in the way it would be later. A coastline could be extended too far. A landmass could be bent or misplaced. A mapmaker could preserve a real report and still misfit it into a larger scheme. Mistakes in old maps are not failures of intelligence. They are records of knowledge under strain. That phrase matters. Knowledge under strain. The Antarctica hypothesis asks us to see the strange southern line as a trace of extraordinary ancient accuracy. Geology and cartographic context ask us to consider another possibility, that the line is a trace of early modern uncertainty. The first option makes the map a relic of a lost global survey. The second makes it a document of a world struggling to assemble new geography from broken sources. The second option may be less spectacular, but it is more deeply connected to everything we know about Piri Reis. He was a compiler, not a prophet. His work gathered information from multiple sources of unequal quality. Some sources may have been recent, some older, some first-hand, some copied, some accurate, some distorted. The map's strangeness does not require him to be preserving a perfect ancient coastline. It may show him doing what map makers often had to do, turning uncertain information into a usable image. And yet, the scientific objections do not make the map ordinary. They make the mystery more precise. Instead of asking, "Did Piri Reis map Antarctica?" we can ask better questions. Why did the southern coast take the form it did? What sources might have shaped it? How did early 16th century cartographers imagine the lower Atlantic? What conventions did they inherit? What did they misunderstand? What did they know earlier than we might expect? What has been lost from the chain of transmission? These questions do not close the door. They open a more honest one. Because the real problem with the Antarctica theory is not that it is imaginative. Imagination is often the beginning of inquiry. The problem begins when imagination refuses to be corrected by evidence. A theory that cannot be weakened by geology, chronology, or comparison is no longer an investigation. It has become belief wearing the clothing of research. The Piri Reis map deserves better than that. It deserves to be mysterious in the right way, not as a forced proof of an ice-free continent, but as a fragile witness to the uneven movement of knowledge. It shows us how coastlines could travel farther than the ships that first recorded them. It shows how lost sources can survive only as altered descendants. It shows how a map can preserve both information and error so tightly intertwined that later centuries cannot easily separate them. The cold evidence of geology does not destroy the map's power. It protects it from being consumed by a single legend. When mystery meets geology, the story becomes less like a secret door and more like a test of intellectual patience. We have to let the ice speak. We have to let the parchment speak. And we have to resist the urge to make one silence answer for the other. What remains is not proof of Antarctica before the ice. What remains is a damaged Ottoman map, drawn from lost and living sources, carrying a southern coastline that still unsettles the eye. Not because it solves prehistory, but because it reveals how easily human longing can gather around the edge of the unknown. A modern map is so familiar that it can become invisible. We open a phone, pinch the screen, rotate the Earth, and expect geography to obey. Coastlines settle into place. Continents hold their shapes. Distance becomes a number. A blue dot tells us where we are, with a confidence that would have seemed almost supernatural to a sailor in Piri Reis's world. That confidence is useful. It is also dangerous when we carry it backward, because old maps were not failed versions of our maps. They were made under different pressures, with different tools, for different kinds of minds and journeys. To understand the Piri Reis map, we have to stop asking only whether it matches the modern world, and start asking what kind of world it was trying to organize. A portolan chart, for example, was not designed to give a satellite-like view of the Earth. It emerged from maritime practice. Its strength lay in relationships useful to navigation. Coasts, ports, bearings, islands, passages, directions. The dense webs of lines that cross such charts can look decorative to modern eyes, but they reflect a seafaring way of thinking. They helped sailors move through known waters by direction and connection, not by viewing the planet as a mathematically standardized globe. That distinction matters. When a portolan habit of mapping is stretched toward wider oceans and newly reported continents, distortion is not a surprise. It is almost inevitable. A system that works well for familiar seas can begin to strain when asked to hold the Atlantic, Africa, South America, and speculative southern geography on one surface. The mapmaker may still be skilled. The sources may still be valuable, but the result can become a negotiation rather than a measurement. This is one reason the Piri Reis map has generated so many arguments. It contains lines that invite recognition, but it does not behave like a modern projection. Coastlines may appear shifted, compressed, extended, or rotated. Areas drawn from better source material may sit beside areas drawn from weaker source material. A coastline copied from one tradition may not fit neatly with another coastline copied from a different tradition. The map is not lying. It is showing the seams of its own construction. Those seams are where imagination enters. A rotated coastline can become a hidden continent. A stretched shore can become evidence of ancient precision. A copied error can become a clue. A speculative line can become a suppressed truth. The human eye does not merely see, it completes. It looks for pattern, especially when a mystery has already been suggested. Once the viewer has been told, "This may show Antarctica," the eye starts working like an advocate. It searches for similarities and forgives differences. If a curve does not match, perhaps the map was distorted. If a distance fails, perhaps the scale changed. If the orientation is wrong, perhaps the source was rotated. Some of those adjustments may be reasonable in careful cartographic analysis. But if every mismatch can be explained away, the comparison becomes impossible to disprove. And a claim that cannot be tested is not strong. It is protected from failure. That is the delicate trap of famous mystery maps. They offer enough resemblance to tempt us and enough ambiguity to defend almost any interpretation. Projection is part of this, but not only in the technical sense. Yes, map projections matter because any attempt to place a curved Earth onto a flat surface involves compromise. Shapes, distances, directions, and areas cannot all be preserved perfectly at once. Early mapmakers also worked without the global measurement systems later cartographers would develop. But there is another kind of projection happening as well. The projection of modern desire onto old ink. We want maps to reveal, so we sometimes forget that maps also conceal, distort, simplify, inherit, and guess. A map is not just geography. It is an argument about geography. It tells us what its maker believed, what his sources allowed, what his culture expected, what his audience needed, and what he chose to make visible. Sometimes it preserves observation. Sometimes it preserves authority. Sometimes it preserves error, because the error came from a source too respected to ignore. This is especially important for copied maps. When a mapmaker copies from older material, he does not only copy knowledge. He may copy uncertainty in a more confident form. He may copy a coastline without the original warning that it was approximate. He may combine two sources that described the same region differently, creating a hybrid shape that belongs fully to neither. He may misread a place name, misunderstand orientation, or adjust the drawing to fit the available space. Over generations, a useful observation can become strange, and a strange line can later be mistaken for impossible knowledge. The Piri Reis map, as a surviving fragment, intensifies the problem. Because the whole context is gone, we cannot fully see how the missing portions might have clarified the surviving ones. The fragment is forced to stand alone, and modern viewers lean heavily on every visible curve. Torn edges create interpretive pressure. The less we have, the more each detail seems to matter. That can make a map feel more intentional than it really is. Imagine hearing only a few sentences from a long conversation and building an entire argument from them. The words are real. The speaker existed. The conversation mattered. But without the rest, tone and meaning become unstable. The Piri Reis fragment has a similar vulnerability. It speaks, but not in complete paragraphs. This does not mean we should distrust everything on it. Quite the opposite. We should trust it carefully. It is evidence, but evidence of a particular kind. It tells us that Piri Reis had access to a range of geographic materials. It tells us that Ottoman cartography could absorb Atlantic information. It tells us that early 16th century maritime knowledge moved across political and cultural boundaries. It tells us that lost sources mattered. What it does not do is automatically tell us that every suggestive resemblance is a secret truth. The difference between resemblance and identification is crucial. A coastline may resemble another coastline because it is derived from it. It may resemble it by coincidence. It may resemble it because the viewer has selected the parts that fit and ignored the parts that do not. It may resemble it because map distortions can make unrelated shapes look meaningful. This is not cynicism. It is method. And method is what lets mystery survive without collapsing into fantasy. The imagination of maps is powerful because maps carry authority even when they are uncertain. A drawn line feels decisive. It divides land from sea, known from unknown, here from elsewhere. But in early cartography, many lines were less like borders and more like questions written in ink. That may be the best way to see the controversial parts of the Piri Reis map. Not as a hoax, not as proof of a forbidden ancient atlas, not as a simple mistake to be laughed away, but as questions made visible by a mapmaker working at the edge of available knowledge. The coastline that seems too bold may be a record of information entering the Ottoman world from distant voyages. It may be an inherited distortion. It may be an attempt to reconcile incompatible reports. It may be a sign that Piri Reis trusted a source we no longer possess. Each possibility has a different meaning, and none should be swallowed too quickly by the most dramatic answer. The real discipline is to let the map remain difficult. Modern certainty wants old maps to confess. It wants them to say, clearly, either I knew Antarctica or I did not. But the fragment does not speak in that language. It speaks in the grammar of Portolan practice, copied sources, maritime intelligence, imperial curiosity, and incomplete information. Its distortions are not obstacles to the story. They are the story, because every distortion marks a place where human knowledge struggled to travel farther than human certainty. Every uncertain line reminds us that maps are not born from omniscience. They are born from effort, from sailors reporting what they saw, cartographers arranging what they trusted, and cultures trying to make the unknown usable before it became fully understood. The Piri Reis map remains haunting because it lives in that tension. It is close enough to the world we know to feel recognizable, and far enough from it to feel unstable. It shows us not a perfect Earth, but a mind at work inside an imperfect age, gathering fragments and drawing continuity where certainty had not yet arrived. And perhaps that is why people keep returning to it. Not because the map gives one clear answer, but because it reminds us that every map is also a portrait of the limits of knowing. After all the ice, all the legends, all the arguments over coastlines, the real secret of the Piri Reis map may be quieter than people expect. It may not be Atlantis. It may not be Antarctica. It may not be a hidden Templar archive or the last trace of a civilization erased before memory began. The real secret may be the network. That sounds less dramatic at first, almost disappointing. A network is not as easy to picture as a lost continent. It does not rise from the ocean in a single moonlit shape. It has no golden capital, no sealed vault, no final revelation waiting behind a locked door. A network is messy. It is made of people, roots, habits, exchanges, accidents, and need. But for this story, that may be exactly why it matters. The Piri Reis map survives as a fragment, but behind it was a world that was anything but fragmentary. Islamic geography, Mediterranean seamanship, Iberian exploration, African coastal knowledge, Ottoman intelligence, older Portolan traditions, and the practical experience of sailors all pressed against one another in the early 16th century. They did not merge neatly. They collided, overlapped, contradicted, and sometimes copied each other without fully understanding where a line had first been drawn. This is where the map becomes most revealing, not because it proves a single impossible source, but because it shows how knowledge could travel across borders even when people were at war. The Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds were divided by religion, empire, language, and violence, yet information moved anyway. It moved in captured ships. It moved in the memories of pilots. It moved through merchants whose business depended on knowing more than they said. It moved through translated texts, copied charts, rumors in ports, and the forced intimacy of conflict. War destroys knowledge, but it also redistributes it. That is one of the uncomfortable truths of maritime history. A battle could sink a vessel and erase the root memory of its crew. But a captured vessel could also deliver charts, instruments, and experienced sailors into enemy hands. A prisoner might speak because he was afraid. A pilot might serve a new master because survival required it. A map might pass from one world to another, not through scholarly friendship, but through coercion, theft, ransom, or opportunism. Knowledge does not always travel politely. Piri Reis stood within that reality. His achievement was not that he escaped history, but that he belonged to it so completely. He gathered what his world made available. Some first-hand knowledge, some inherited material, some copied sources, some claims that were likely more reliable than others. He transformed scattered maritime intelligence into a visual form that could outlive its immediate use. And because the sources behind the map have partly vanished, later viewers have been tempted to replace the lost network with a single secret. That temptation is understandable. A single secret is cleaner. It gives the story a center. It lets us imagine that the mystery can be solved by finding the one missing document, the one forbidden archive, the one ancient civilization that explains every strange line at once. But history rarely works with that kind of tidiness. The more plausible truth is more crowded and less obedient. Piri Reis's map likely emerged from many channels of knowledge, each carrying its own distortions. Some information may have come from the world of Columbus and early Atlantic voyages. Some may have come from Portuguese or Spanish maritime intelligence, directly or indirectly. Some may have come from older Mediterranean cartographic habits. Some may have reflected inherited assumptions about southern lands. Some may have been corrected by experience. Some may have been damaged by copying. The result was not pure accuracy. It was accumulation. And accumulation can be astonishing. We often underestimate compilation because we live in an age that celebrates the original discovery. The first arrival, the first sighting, the first name attached to an achievement. But many of history's most important works are not acts of solitary invention. They are acts of gathering. Someone stands at a crossroads, listens carefully, weighs competing claims, and preserves material that might otherwise scatter. Piri Reis was that kind of figure. His greatness does not depend on making him supernatural. It depends on recognizing the difficulty of his task. To compile maritime knowledge in his age was to sort through unstable evidence before evidence had modern institutions to stabilize it. There were no satellite images to settle a coastline, no global database to check a report, no clean separation between political intelligence, sailor experience, classical inheritance, and rumor. The mapmaker had to judge, and judgment leaves traces. A modern viewer may ask why a coastline bends strangely, but the better question may be, what source did Piri Reis trust enough to draw it that way? What had reached him from where, and in what condition? Was he preserving a useful error because it came from a respected chart? Was he combining two reports that did not fit? Was he extending a known coast into an unknown region because the alternative was an emptiness his tradition did not encourage? These questions do not make the map less mysterious. They make it more historically alive. The real secret of Piri Reis is that the map is not only a map of places, it is a map of contact. Every uncertain line marks not just a geographical problem, but a human connection we can no longer fully reconstruct. Somewhere behind the ink were sailors speaking across languages, enemies learning from enemies, old charts being copied in new settings, and empires trying to turn uncertainty into advantage. That is why the map feels larger than its surviving size. A fragment can carry the weight of a vanished system. We look at the parchment and see land and sea. But what we are really seeing is movement. Movement of ships, movement of stories, movement of documents, movement of power. The map is not a frozen image of the world. It is a residue of circulation, and circulation is often where the deepest histories hide. The modern hunger for a buried secret may actually point toward a real absence, but not the one legend promises. We are sensing that something has been lost. We are right to sense it. The missing thing is not necessarily an advanced prehistoric atlas. It may be the everyday working archive of seafaring civilization. Rough charts, pilot books, route memories, dockside intelligence, copies made for use rather than preservation. Those things vanish easily. They are not always treated as treasures. A working map is folded, stained, corrected, carried into bad weather. A sailor's knowledge dies in his body. A copied chart becomes obsolete and is replaced. A state secret loses value and is discarded. A palace archive saves one fragment and not the chain that made it meaningful. Then centuries later, we stand before the survivor and ask it to explain all the dead witnesses. No wonder it cannot answer cleanly. The real secret, then, is not hidden beneath the ice. It is hidden in the broken transmission of human knowledge. Piri Reis preserved a moment when worlds touched each other through necessity, violence, curiosity, and ambition. His map is not evidence that history is false. It is evidence that history is porous. Civilizations that appear separate in textbooks were often connected by water, by trade, by war, and by the practical intelligence required to survive between shores. That may be less spectacular than a lost super-civilization, but it is not less profound, because it reminds us that knowledge is rarely owned by one people, one empire, one language, or one age. It passes through hands. It changes shape. It carries scars from every transfer. And sometimes, when the original chain is gone, what remains looks almost impossible. Piri Reis did not need to know the whole world to create a map that still unsettles ours. He needed access to fragments and the skill to bind them together. That binding is the secret, not a perfect ancient truth hidden in the parchment, but an imperfect human achievement. The gathering of scattered worlds into one fragile surface, where fact, error, ambition, and memory could survive long enough for us to mistake their mixture for a miracle. In the end, the Piri Reis map does not give us a clean confession. It does not step forward and say, "Here is Antarctica." It does not prove a civilization before the Ice Age. It does not hand us a Templar archive, a lost Atlantean survey, or a perfect key to the vanished sources behind it. What it gives us is more fragile than that. A fragment, a surviving piece of parchment, drawn in 1513, rediscovered in 1929, carrying traces of a world that knew more than we can now fully reconstruct and less than modern legend sometimes wants it to know. That tension is the reason it endures. The map is not powerful because it settles the argument. It is powerful because it refuses to become simple. There is fact here. Piri Reis was real. His map was real. Its sources were partly older. Its Atlantic geography matters. Its rediscovery inside Topkapı Palace placed it back into history at exactly the moment when modern people were ready to see in it something larger than a nautical document. There is error here too. Distortion, uncertainty, possible misreadings. The strain of early cartography trying to fit new coastlines into inherited systems. Lines that may look suggestive not because they are impossibly accurate, but because human beings are very good at finding meaning in broken shapes, and there is loss. That may be the deepest layer of all. The Piri Reis map is surrounded by absences, missing source maps, vanished conversations, dead pilots, discarded charts, damaged archives, voyages remembered only through copies of copies. We often speak of lost history as if it were a locked chamber waiting to be opened. More often, it is a coastline eroded beyond recognition. You can still see where something once was, but not enough to rebuild it without imagination. The danger is letting imagination become possession. When a mystery survives for long enough, people begin to feel it belongs to their preferred explanation. The skeptic wants it reduced to mistake. The believer wants it elevated into revelation. But the fragment resists both. It is too important to dismiss and too ambiguous to crown as proof of the extraordinary. That is not a failure. It is the honest shape of many historical objects. The map's legacy lies in the collision it preserves: empire and exploration, practical seamanship and political secrecy, Islamic and European knowledge, copied sources and first-hand observation, real geography and inherited error. It is a document of human ambition, but also of human limitation. It shows us trying to draw the world while still learning what the world was. And perhaps that is why the southern landmass still holds the eye. Not because it must be Antarctica, not because it must hide a civilization beneath the ice, but because it sits at the border between evidence and desire. We look at it and feel the old hunger, the wish that history has kept one last impossible secret, waiting for us to be clever enough to recognize it. Maybe history does hide secrets, but not always the ones we ask for. Sometimes the secret is not that an ancient civilization mapped the earth with lost precision. Sometimes the secret is that ordinary human knowledge, sailors' knowledge, traders' knowledge, enemy knowledge, stolen knowledge, copied knowledge, was far more connected, fragile, and powerful than we imagined. That is enough. The Piri Reis map does not need to prove a hidden continent to remain haunting. It only has to remind us that the past was not silent, merely damaged. Some of its voices reached us clearly. Others arrived as fragments, warped by distance, ink, politics, weather, and time. In that sense, the map is not a final answer. It is a survivor. And like all survivors, it carries both memory and injury. It tells us something happened. Something was gathered. Something was known. Something was lost. But it does not owe us the comfort of certainty, so we leave it where it belongs. Not in the hands of fantasy, and not under the cold dismissal of easy skepticism, but in the dim, difficult space where real history often lives. A torn map, a vanished chain of sources, a world still learning its own shape. And beneath it all, not proof that history is hiding everything from us, but a quieter warning that what humanity knows can disappear far more easily than we like to believe.